There we go. Okay. Oh, before I forget, this is not the way to start recording. For those of you who haven't been here, that's hot water on the left there with the red button, and filtered water on the right with the blue. So yourself a cup of tea. There's cups back there. Just feel free to stand up. It's not going to bother me. If you need to go use the restroom or get a drink or something, or get a cookie if you whatever you might do. I'm gonna have to check Jim's pockets before we. So it's a little funny. We haven't actually met in person like this in a while. I guess we met last week, and sort of. But for those of you who are just joining us, and I mean, you haven't been with us for many of the last ones. What we typically do is we do sort of a check-in, and then we dive into a book, and we are looking at them more holistically. So we will look at some passages. So if you have a Bible with you, you can go ahead and open it up to Matthew, because we will be referencing some things there, some specific passages. And what I have done is I have just read some resources and kind of cobbled together some things that I think are interesting about its structure, its authorship, its flow, themes, and that sort of thing. And then typically we'll go over the structure of the book as well, and maybe go through some passages. The actual read scripture is minimal, but not out of intention, just more out of we'll look when they surface, we tend to read them. So where to start? Matthew, meaning a gift of God, is the actual meaning of it. But interestingly enough, as we'll talk about in a minute, actually in its Greek form is similar to the Greek word for disciple or learn. So there's something embedded even in the name of Matthew that sort of sets one out to view it as a place of learning. It has the illustrious place of being the first of the four Gospels. And we talked about that, I think it was last week, where I said Ed Nettleton had said that it should have been John, and then Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts. And I like that. But I learned today, actually, that the reason it's first is not because it was written first necessarily, because it sort of came into being. It had its role as. In fact, they realized that Mark actually was the first one written, and we'll get into some of those details as we go into it. But the name, let's start with. It is often attributed to being written by Matthew, the tax collector, the disciple of Jesus. But it probably wasn't written for 30 to 40 years, they estimate, after Jesus's time that Matthew would have spent with them. So largely the stories and the narratives and things that actually are happening in that wouldn't have been, they would have been passed down orally, or they might have been fragmented. And the reason they know that is because in Matthew, there is a mention of the fall of the destruction of Jerusalem, which didn't happen until 70 AD. So that doesn't mean that the stories and some of the narratives weren't part of the tradition, and very much would have been, and should not be under value. Literate, they started writing things down. It actually wasn't even named Matthew until the late second, probably around. Which I thought was about 100 years after it was written. And there is not really a solid record, conclusive result of what was called before that. But it didn't actually officially get solidified in that. Interestingly enough, the name Matthew is only mentioned twice throughout it. And it's the whole book is sort of written in a biographical form. So he sort of is inserted this Matthew tax collector character in it. But it comes in 9:9 and 10:3. So sort of in the first half. So then the question is, who wrote it? was it a name that it was attached because it came from communities that sort of came under the Matthean school of thought, and they were his disciples? They constructed this together and took some of his work. This was some of the theories that were early on, that perhaps the name Matthew, because it resembles disciple or learn, maybe it's meant to say, hey, we're all Matthews to some extent, to learn, and that. But we don't know, is the bottom line. But what we do know is that it was around 70 AD that it's thought that was the book was probably written. And at the time, it was, we know now, when it first came out and was first sort of brought into certain official status, that was not taken into consideration. The scholarship over the past realized that 600 there are 600 of the 601 verses in Mark that are repeated in Matthew. Matthew reorganizes them and adds additional materials. And actually there is, and I'll have a diagram that I saved here, and I'm going to put it on the screen, and then I'll flip it around for you all here. But then so the 600 verses of Matthew are from the 601 verses of Mark. So that means the entire book of Mark is somehow contained in content. It was not verbatim necessarily, but the content. And so they've identified the structures of what we call the synoptic gospels, or those gospels that have similarities. And then there are 220 verses in Matthew that actually are also, that come from a source called Q. And originally they thought Q was just sort of, they just named it Q, but it's an extra source, but they were what's that? Q. Yeah, Q. Well, no, I mean, I think the Qumran actually is what sort of struck me out, or the Dead Sea Scrolls sort of things. But Q is the source that Luke and Matthew get their extra material. So what happens is, let me see if I'm going to share a photo here. And we'll look at this again because it's okay. So tell me online, can you let me know, can you see that? Online?
Yeah.
People online? Okay, I want to make sure.
Yes.
So
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. If you can see that? Maybe you can step over there if you can't see. The purple in the middle, and this is a different formulation, but I liked the way it did it because it kind of explains a little bit in more clear terms. But the purple in the middle is Mark was the original author of those, and it was just deemed that it was written first. And then Matthew takes 46% of Matthew is constituted from that 76%, and 41 of Luke comes from that as well. So that this is the Q source down here, the double tradition, which said very early on, well, there's this, and primarily they were sayings and stories of Jesus, and they were passed down in fragments, and those got inserted where they needed to go. Or where they thought they should go, each author unto himself. But those formed that 24 and 23% of Matthew and Luke respectively. Now, Luke and Matthew also have what's called the M source, or the L source, which means there are things that are 20% of Matthew is unique to Matthew, and 35% of Luke is sort of unique to Luke. And then up here, they show you that there has been a small overlap between Mark and Luke from a different source that is not in Matthew, and likewise Mark. And so they're giving you and then really the only thing that is unique to 3% of Mark is actually unique to itself. This is not really surprising, because what happens is at some point Mark's gospel was probably written and was looked at as the authoritative source. And then over time, those documents, those sayings, those things wouldn't have been like, oh, we're stealing from Mark. It would have just been a part of the stories, but then those stories would have been transferred. And because each of the gospels have a very different intent or audience, they change the material. Sometimes they change the chronology of the stories. For example, we'll see today that right before Jesus goes into, he sort of rides in on the donkey, and then in John he goes from, this is something that happens much earlier. The turning of the temples. He goes into the but in Matthew, it comes after his arrival in the temple and almost becomes like the preceding story of why some of the violence started to occur, why they were so mad, because he went in, he disrupted the temple into what it was. But you have it's only one story, but a major discrepancy in the chronology of when it happened in Jesus's life. We don't have an answer for that. You can pick and choose which one. In the end, it doesn't really matter. We can split hairs over it, but those are the things that tend to create new denominations rather than unite us. I'm going to unshare this now again. Does anyone have any questions just about this? That's called source criticism, and then basically what they do, and they do it in the Old Testament when we talked about Genesis, and you had your priestly and your Yahwehist and your what are those sources? I don't remember. But every book has multiple sources that are contributing to it. So they recognize those sort of things and they pick it apart. But in the Gospels, it really is like, well, these verses all match up line for line. That doesn't mean they would have been written exactly the same, but the stories are in some of the sections. But as we'll see in Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. So he took Mark, he took the narratives, he took the essential nature, like Mark's stripped down, as much as you have, like it's the abridged version of it. It's the abridged gospel, but it's just sort of, it begins with Jesus' baptism and ends at his death. Matthew adds some stuff in the front, and we'll look at what those front things did and how they functioned. Question?
So one of the things can I? Well, maybe not. We're frozen.
Okay. I can hear you.
Okay.
I can
I ask a question? Okay, Jason, I just had a question. I always thought like Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark. So you're saying actually it's a group of writers and put everything together that wrote these? Is that what you're saying?
Depending on the book, sometimes yes.
Okay.
Typically, they would have been followers of Mark or followers of. The fact that it was written, and I looking at my notes. This is a rewriting of Mark in 70 AD, and what that was is after the fall of the temple. You have to remember. So again, those of you journey through the Old Testament, the fall of the temple the first time was pretty devastating. So they finally get this temple back, and they're doing good, and they have it for maybe 500 years or so. And now in 70 AD, there's a Roman-Jewish conflict, and the temple is destroyed. Now, for Jews, this is in their memory 500 years ago of like this sort of bad things that happened and that God abandoned them and they were without a temple. But you have this whole new faction of Jewish Christians who have now have to interpret, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but have to interpret this sense of the destruction of Jerusalem.
So you're equating the fall of the temple and Jerusalem.
Well, the temple, the destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. The fall of Jerusalem happened between 67, and it was like 6 years, 67 to 73 of the Jewish Roman conflict. So my guess is the destruction in general was happening, but those first few years ramped up and culminated in what usually people would cite in a date would be 70 AD for Christian time. Of the temple, but Jerusalem fell generally during. I don't know the exact point at where they were. We've done it now, but I would imagine probably prior. But what's coming? It's not as if it was written in 70 AD, and actually they thought. Most people think it was probably written between 75 and 100, so in over a 25-year period, which means they were collecting the writings. They were assembling. So no, was it Mark? Was it a dude named Matthew? Was a tax collector who would have been, I don't know, like 80 at this point, because I don't know how old he was at the time when Jesus was there, but at around 30, if you want to just do it from flat zero. Let's say that the tax collector was 25, reasonably. Well, we're now at this point, we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem. You're talking 40 years later, so he's in 65. Could have written it? Yes, absolutely. They contributed to 100%. Does that mean he sat down to write it? Not. because how many 100 years later we're sort of compiling it and putting it together. Or naming it. Sorry, 100 years later. About 40 years later, actually, it was probably canonized, or not canonized, but recognized more so. But then in the end, those things don't really matter all that much. They do debating about it because he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, because there are other first century authors that use him as sort of a source. So between the years of 75 and 100, you have the development of the Didache, which was a teaching, and you also have a guy whose name is Ignatius, who wrote letters, and he mentioned the book of Matthew. So at some point in that period, this book came into being and started to be shared because it was being referenced, which is a good thing. This is how the gospel spread. And that really, just as a reminder, we're kind of doing it, you're seeing it sort of when we look ahead and see a little bit how the books were written, we're sort of jumping ahead of Acts and seeing what happened after. But that's the thing, is the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, I mean, John, if anyone sat down to write it, I would say John. But most of these things were fragments and things that they put together and pulled together. It was the nature of the way you store documents, and they moved beyond that sense of preservation of scrolls in the same way too. And so you have these small home communities, and you got to remember, in the first century, it was, you could be persecuted from 60 on by Nero for being a Christian. So they can enter into your home, and if they found a fragment of the scriptures, you could be. So much of that early church was passed down by oral tradition, and passed down by memorization, and passed down by the community that actually lived. It's called first order theology, and it means the theology of the lived community.
Did each community pick somebody to be the leader? And maybe to memorize the story? No,
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say no, but I would say, if I had to guess, I would say 90% no, but maybe there could have been I don't know if they had bards that sort of were meant to know. Rabbis were, the extension of that wasn't a foreign thing. So, and you'll see within Matthew, actually, there's so much Jewish influence and really Jewish audience. This is written for new Jewish Christians. Like, really, the fact that we read it and and is honestly is one of my biggest complaints about the gospel, about preaching the gospels, is when people preach Matthew, they often preach it as if it was being preached to a Gentile. And if you take it out of the context of what it was written because, as you'll see, the destruction of the temple just happened. And now Jews and new Jewish Christians didn't know. And so this is a reinterpretation, if you will, almost of Matthew or of Mark, for a newly devastated wrestling community that is struggling with not only what it means to be Jewish, and by this time, the other piece to go into this is that this is 40 years after Jesus. So by this time, Gentiles are now joining the crews. So now you have these Jewish converts, and right after Jesus was just Jews. And then eventually, as it expanded, there is that wrestling, and we see that in some of the Paul's epistles of circumcision, not circumcision, eating regulations, not these are, and they're trying to say these are all been abolished by Christ, but that identity that is so ingrained into who Jews were, trying to wrestle with that. This book is written to help them understand how they can be both connected to the covenant of that God established with Judaism, with the Jews, and also express their lives as Christians. It deals with, and in part, as we'll talk about in a minute, that's why it starts with a genealogy, because it's demonstrating to Jews and to possible Jewish converts that Jesus, the Christ, who they claim is the Messiah, fulfilled the prophecies that were found and the covenants that were created in Moses and in David, and that he is the fulfillment of the new covenant. Yeah.
So in the early church, were they also practicing the rituals of the Jewish?
Oh, yeah.
Religion? And when did that fade out and it go more to what we know today?
I haven't studied that to know exactly. I mean, I think that there are probably remnants of, if you look at Christian catechesis, in the field of Christian education, we turn to Jewish catechesis all the time. We look at it and say, what did the Jews do? I don't think that we've ever, I think there's so much about Christianity that is absolutely influenced by Judaism. I mean, even the Eucharist that we celebrate, Christ's body and blood, this is a Christianized version of the Passover.
But in answer to his question,
Yeah.
it really faded out when Paul on the road to Damascus had a conversion experience and began preaching the gospel of grace.
Yeah, but I think Paul still, the traditions of the Jewish traditions still bled into the New. I mean, I think
They did.
Yeah, and honestly, I think where I would like to say where we see a stark cutoff would have to be in the 4th century when Constantine legalized Christianity and made the state religion, because then you had a strong Roman influence that immediately took the theology of what was this sort of growing, several hundred-year-old religion that had taken hold of the region. But prior to that, were illegal to be, so it's like in the underground religion, and sanctioned it. And I think that at that point you have a lot of more Western ideals that are placed around, and even the formalization of it.
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
What kept it going?
What going?
The religion, I mean,
Spirit.
spirit.
Man, that was a softball.
Yeah.
No, the spirit. Well, I mean, because it was real. I mean, because when you encounter Christ, I mean, they say the word is self-authenticating, and sometimes that word is realized in the community of faith. And for them, that's what it would have been. It would have just been a community of faith. But it was and you got to think for the first few centuries, in particular that first century, the vast majority of the people were that had converted there was a large portion of Jews. But that's that tapered off at some point. At some point, you cut your ties and you sort of split ways. And actually, Matthew is kind of harsh. Matthew, of all of the Gospels, Matthew has been looked at as the one, if any of them can produce anti-Semitic thought, Matthew could, because Matthew's kind of hard on the Jewish leaders, hard on the Jewish systems. But Matthew also is trying to speak to the Jews and differentiate them, and saying, no, if you believe in the Messiah, you're on this side of the fence. And at that point, there was no understanding that, I would confess an understanding that when Jesus returns again, that the Jewish hope of a Messiah will be found in the second coming of Christ in the way it wasn't found in the first coming. But at that time, in that first century, those early Jewish Christians did not think that the rest of the Jews were this is the new covenant. It was like, we are the true remnant of faith. They're the apostate. Because they didn't believe in the Messiah that has come, the covenant was going with the Jewish Christians, not staying back with the non-convert Christians who were sticking to Judaism. And the Pharisees were so high and up and mighty on themselves that really you had folk Jewish religion to some extent, very, but far more adherent. But then you had, institutional religion like we have today in all forms. Yeah.
Wasn't it also, it's kind of skimmed through the whole book, and when you get that overview, the number of people that were healed, the number of miracles that occurred, there had to be a lot of talk within the whole culture and society about all the miraculous things that were happening.
Yes, I would imagine there was. And in that in large part, that's why you'll see through, I think it's the people argue that either the book is broken up into 3 sections or 5. I can see the 5 works fine. But in the second section, you see Jesus start his earthly ministry. And as we saw in the other Gospels, Jesus goes and Jesus heals, meeting the basic needs, and then he proclaims. The problem is that people aren't coming to him for the proclamation, they're coming to him for the healing. And so that's why he retreats, that's why he gets away, because there's only so much he can do. He's meeting that immediate need, but the immediate need does not meet the eternal need. So but that was his period. It was there for part of his ministry was not just to proclaim the coming kingdom and something that they couldn't understand, his death on the cross, but was to proclaim the good news of this whole revolution that was going to change everything. And but in order to gather that audience, he healed them. Did he have to? No. I mean, but pretty much, there are passages say he just they touching his garments, getting near him, dropping, you have crazy stuff. And really, we forget too, that the miracles that happened were both phenomenal, but they're probably more almost phenomenal to us because we don't see that supernatural and stuff in our world today in the same way. Not that it's not there. I firmly believe that it is there. I just think that we live in, honestly, and speaking with those of you who were there yesterday, we live in a modern era that denies mystery and denies the spirit world and doesn't acknowledge the fact that, who knows, there could be spirits looming around us right now. And maybe if we were in a different state of being, we could see them. But, being raised in the Pentecostal tradition, I would never deny the presence of a spirit world. I've just been too close to a denomination that dwells in that sort of space. Now, do I, but I have a deep respect. It's not my theology now, but no, I think there are things that we can't see that are present there. And so I think that for them, these miracles probably weren't as, like, someone healing might not have been a huge shocker. Like, there were healers that controlled spirits that could move, Reiki. You all know what medical thing, Reiki, where they move energy over this? No? Yeah. It's called Reiki. I know it's a little weird. Some people say that that's what Jesus did to heal the centurion's daughter when sent his power through the world. But it's a whole validated medical profession. I had to learn about it when I did clinical pastoral education in a hospital, but they move energy in people, and they believe that our bodies are energy, and they move that energy, and they can move energy from up here if there's a block. I don't know what they do. It looks, to be honest with you, I think I probably buy more into hypnosis than I do Reiki, but at the end, there are things that we don't understand. And when we look at scripture, in particular, as we look at the section where Jesus is talking about these miracles, those were more normal through that period of the world than they are in our Western world now. Saying that, they are very real in Southern Hemisphere of our world, even today.
Well, they didn't have modern medicine like we have.
No.
So, that was pretty much what they had.
No, exactly.
And we have modern medicine, which kind of takes the place of
We don't
some of
need it.
those miracles.
Yes.
That were done.
Well, and there's a miracle to also knowing what the knowledge of modern medicine is a miracle. So we're uncovering things and realizing how these things, so they both have their place. The challenge is when one tries to obliterate the existence of the other. In other words, the spirit world says, oh, science, or science says, oh, there's no spirit world. They're both, anyone who claims anything absolutely like that is a fool. So.
Could you explain a little bit about his use of the kingdom of heaven? Isn't he the one that just says the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven?
Well, in large part because the Jews had always expected to have some sort of payoff at the end.
Now, is this kind of like we think of what will happen at the end of the world, or is this
Yes.
now and then?
Well, yes and no. Well, no, to be honest with you. So there's a kingdom reign on earth that the Jews expected. They expected it. And I think that you see that actually in bits and pieces of Matthew, that overthrow, that military, I think I wrote it down here somewhere. I draw pictures. What I wrote down was in 14 through 20, when they wrestle with Jesus's identity, because Jesus is flip-flopping everything. In 14 through 20, Jesus is flip-flopping everything around. It's called the upside. It's the passage that deals with what we call the upside down kingdom. And one of the sources that I was reading said, to be honest with you, I didn't look them up, but I trust that they were right. Psalm 2 and Daniel 2 as an example of this military leader. If anyone wants to look that up, I'd be happy to have you read that. But the idea behind it is that even up to the point where Peter cuts off the ear because he thinks this is going to be a might and power thing. Simon the Zealot was absolutely 100% in this vein of followers of Jesus who were more military oriented, militaristic more. They wanted it over. They were preparing. Although they heard Jesus saying this stuff, there was still this sense of, no, and why wouldn't they? For over 500 years, it's really since the time of David, they were promised this king. And Jesus actually at one point in 14 to 20 uses Isaiah 53 as a passage to refer to the suffering servant we find in Isaiah that we looked at. And then, and then at first they thought that was King Cyrus coming back and from Persia and sending the Jews back. But Jesus was the true suffering servant, and he claims that role as the suffering servant. So for the Jews who've been waiting for a Messiah who brings a military force, who ushers in this kingdom of heaven on earth, very much so, because that's already a part of their mindset of what the future holds for the Jewish faith.
So when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, is he trying to give them a different view of what they're thinking it's going to be? Because it goes into mustard seed and all that stuff.
And that's the upside down passages. He's trying to say that their image of what they thought the end days or their end time or the existence of Israel on the earth will be different than what they expected. He's saying this is going to grow. The church was the mustard seed, and we 2,000 years later, in all of our fragmentation, despite that, actually looks a lot like a mustard plant seed, it's fragmented everywhere. Like that expression. Okay, what time is it? Okay, we're fine. It was probably written around Antioch of Syria. Not that makes a difference, just in case you're curious. And part of that is because the mention of Antioch. And I will say the one thing is that the Antiochian church, within the realm of Christianity as a whole globally, and when we say Christian traditions, we mean Orthodox Christian, Orthodox Catholic or Protestant. When we say ecumenical, that also means Orthodox Catholic or Protestant. When we say denominational or interdenominational, that's usually just referring to Protestantism. And then there's interfaith, which is all the different faiths intersecting.
So when you say Catholic, you mean Roman Catholic?
Not when I say the Apostles' Creed,
I know.
but when I say Roman, when I say here in that case Catholic, yes. And I mean, those are the three branches of religion. The Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church is the oldest, and the Roman Catholic Church broke off, and then the Protestant Church. Now, Roman Catholics might argue that they were the true church, but just kidding. But what I'm saying that is that there actually is a very strong Orthodox expression that comes out of Antioch. It's called Antiochian Orthodoxy. And I've been to their churches. Actually, when I went to grad school at Wheaton and I left the Assemblies of God, I hopped into every different type of church, from Roman Catholic to Antiochian Orthodox. And one of the things that impressed me was they all stood for 2 hours, almost 2 hours. I mean, I was exhausted by the time. Kids just wandered underfoot. And sometimes they sat down to do something, but in general, so much of it is standing. And then they all fellowshiped together for several hours after we stayed. It was just this amazing, different sort of like the kids were all there. They're running literally underfoot. But they're a community, and they were gathered and they were present, and this was what they do together. So all that's to say is there's a lot of historic Christian roots that go back to Antioch, and what some of the earliest communities were out of there. A couple of interesting things: the genre of Matthew is not really considered to be an eyewitness account in the same way like Mark or Luke might have been. They're sort of retelling from a first person account. It is really considered to be more of a biography and a constructed one, and that's not surprising considering, again, the stories of Mark that were passed around, and then they were ordered in a way that was meant to communicate something. And the biggest thesis around the structure is that there were 5 sections of Matthew to mirror the 5 books of the Pentateuch, which is not uncommon. You see that in some of the other Old Testament books, 5 sections of the Psalms and so on. But what's unique about it, and we'll look at that structure in a minute, is that it sort of has a narrative followed by a teaching, And again, it's sort of following, you want to talk about the influence of Jewish thought, those sort of rhythmic patterned things that are embedded into New Testament books are absolutely a Jewish thing through and through. The context, as I said, it was written for a Jewish audience. What's interesting about it is, and then what sort of confirms that, is there are no explanations of Jewish traditions or customs. There's an expected base knowledge of Judaism that comes with the readers. It deals largely with issues of identity and lifestyle. And that is because they were, if it was being written and constructed from 75 to 100 after, and the temple had just been torn down again, that's a major piece. Where do we go? Who are we? What happened? This happened, when the fall of Jerusalem happened and they went into exile. Are we going to go into exile? Like there's holy, even though you're still a Jewish Christian, that temple is still a holy place. It wasn't, and for them, because it wasn't for them as though like Jesus is a totally different God when we over here and start church. God dwelled, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, dwelled in that temple in the holies of holies. So when the temple was destroyed, the presence of God was taken from Jerusalem. And even Jewish Christians would have been like, now what? And this book is, this gospel is meant to say, this is a new beginning. And you came from this lineage, you came from this story, you came from this past, and now we're going to move out from that.
Now the Jewish Christians, if they felt the presence of God was in the temple, they don't go along with what Paul preached about the temple of God is you, and the Spirit of God is within you.
No, they wouldn't hold that. Now, again, I don't really know to the extent of that because I'm typically, I know a bit about Judaism. I know enough to get myself in trouble, but not to the extent to know. I don't, that's a good question. I wonder how and I think you probably would have to, like Christianity in any denomination, you're going to get a little slightly different answer, but I wonder how like Orthodox Jews would view the Spirit of God, because I don't believe they would confess that the new covenant has been fulfilled.
Well, wasn't this a mystery that Paul brought in? Is that the Spirit of God was within you?
It was well, no, it wasn't Paul. It was Jeremiah that prophesied it, and it was claimed in Pentecost when they spoke in tongues and other languages.
But Paul is the one that
Well, Paul had this. We'll get to Paul in a few weeks, but I'll give you 30 seconds. Paul is a controversial topic for actually a lot of Roman Catholics because of the fact that Paul never hung out with Jesus.
I know.
He had an encounter with Jesus, but quite frankly, and this is what people would say just crassly, anyone could say that. So and then also, when you look at the bulk of the New Testament, the bulk of it is Pauline theology. Well, we're all riding on the fact that Paul, whoever his companion was with on the road to Damascus, actually, I mean, who knows what happened? I mean, I believe it happened. I think there's a lot, but that's the challenge of Paul to the gospel writers and to the apostles, is that Paul was an apostle, but he was not a first disciple. So there's tension between Paul and Peter, and some would say that our whole, not Jim, but the Protestant Reformation, that was grabbing onto Paul, because what happened is the succession was Paul was actually thought to, predating that would have been Plato, because they thought Paul was very Platonic, but Paul was reinterpreted by Augustine in the 5th century, and then much of the Reformation was based on a sort of new or neo-Augustinian.
So wasn't Paul trained by the apostles?
Paul was in what?
Well, in being a Christian,
Well,
because he came back to Jerusalem and he met with all those.
well, yeah, he met, I'm sure. No, I mean, trained in what way? I don't know. I mean, like
No,
Paul was the most educated of all of them.
I understand it. When they tell them all the stories of Jesus.
Yeah, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
there's difference between that first eyewitness eyewitness account means so much more than you had an encounter on a road that no one was there to prove. You saw Sasquatch? I didn't. Where's the camera? Where's it? But and that's not, and there's tension. There's tension between Pauline thought and sort of Petrine thought. And I would say by that meaning all, James would be thrown into that. And again, because you have Luther focusing on Paul, James now becomes a threat to, because James doesn't mention Jesus and so on and so forth. But you have there are definitely tensions, and I don't know how they work that out. I don't know. But the fact that these letters then were later canonized, but that didn't happen until after the 1st century, long after they were written and passed around from church to church. So by the time they were canonized, those issues, the apostles and Paul, the disciples and Paul, they were all dead at this point. So they weren't even there to speak or to justify. And so all we have then is the fragments that are left that are pieced together that form the books.
But they kind of settled the issue in the council when Paul went to Jerusalem and talked with the apostles and told them what he was telling the Gentiles. And they agreed with
They
what
were
he
fine.
was telling.
There's
them.
no controversy in theology, really. I mean, there are finer points that are debated, but in general, most of the gospel, and really where you get in controversy is that Paul is helping guide the New Testament. We'll get into this when we talk about Paul's letters. Paul is helping guide the New Testament church figure out who they are. So much of what Paul writes about is what Matthew's writing about, identity. So when everything is destroyed around you, who are you? When your entire orientation has been to the physical temple, who are you? There's a lot of one of the things that was noted in all of Matthew is there's a lot of, I'm trying to find it here in my notes, synagogue bashing and Jewish leader bashing, and the idea behind that, which is sort of trying to separate those early Jewish Christians from their perceivably apostate now Orthodox Jews that remained in Judaism. So it just takes on a different flavor in the sense of how they function as a new community. So, all right. Let me find where I'm at.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
This diagram that you presented
Mhm.
shows that Mark is the original book. I have, in this particular Bible that I have, it has each chapter gives information.
Mhm.
And it says that John Mark was not one of the 12 disciples.
You mean for the book of Mark?
For the book of Mark.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
To be honest with you, I'd have to dig around it and read up on it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're basing Matthew and John and Luke on Mark's information here. Something doesn't sound right to me, and I don't know if it's this information.
No, that's probably right. I mean, that's the thing is I think there's a presumption that most of the biblical books were written by the person they're named after.
But he wasn't a disciple, so did God just specifically
Use him to
use
construct it?
Mark and tell him exactly what to write?
Well, no, and see that so it's not a fun concept to grasp because it feels threatening.
Well,
Yeah.
I've always thought that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
Written.
John were all the disciples of Christ.
Luke isn't.
Well, Luke, yeah. I mean, Luke was a physician that was an apostle. I mean, that was around, or I would,
Yeah, I
but
thought he was around.
now he actually, we do think, wrote his book, and John also. But really, John was written probably by. But even then, did they actually sit down and over a period of a year and pen the whole thing? No, that didn't happen.
I think God inspired them. to
The
write.
whole, and this is where you have to trust the whole process of God's Spirit moving through everything. And this goes back, we did this last fall when we talked about the infallibility and how something can be infallible and still have errors. So in other words, you can have errors and did Jesus flip the tables when he came into Jerusalem to ride in a donkey, or did he do it earlier? We have two different eyewitness theoretically coming from eyewitness accounts. Well, how do you reconcile that? Well, is God just messing with us at that point? Like, I'm going to have this story here and this story there just to keep them all on their toes? No, we don't serve a God of confusion. The fact that we often sort of hold to the idea that everything in Scripture is, and I don't want to say perfect because perfect has a wrong, because I do think it's perfect in the sense of I do believe God ordained and orchestrated and spoke and moved through it. But everything, what the Bible is a story of God using broken people to proclaim a perfect message brokenly and still use the good result of it. The whole Old Testament, as we've gone through the last year, is just is a litany of how messed up people are, and how faithful God is. So the notion that we deal with right now in our current culture, that the Bible is perfect, it comes out of really the last few hundred years of the church. Jews would not look at their holy scriptures as being perfect. They'd look at them holy as they're set apart, as they carry the history of the people, as we should ought to look at them. Does that mean that the message behind this is faulty? No. But why would we, when we have a book that's about how humans have screwed everything up all along the way, think that somehow God, just in this one case, has made this instance perfect? It just doesn't make sense. Why would God make this perfect when everything else is messy? No, this is a story of God using broken people, and that means the transmission of it can be broken. And honestly, who decided? As we'll see, this wasn't even canonized for, into the 2nd century of the church. And if it's not even decided on that it's gospel in the 2nd century, we trust that God used that and that it's useful for teaching, and that it carries the message, the infallible message of Jesus. But that doesn't mean, and the need, and this is what we'll see in this book that we're reading, the need for the Bible to be perfect is an Enlightenment ideal. And it chains us to it. And when it's not perfect, we feel threatened. But it doesn't have to be perfect, because we're not perfect. And we're the ones who put it down through God's guidance. Yeah.
But if it was God-inspired book,
Yeah.
then wouldn't it reason that maybe it was also God-inspired what had to be written there?
Yeah, absolutely. I
mean,
think
he made known through these individuals what needed to be known.
100%. And God moved in the same way God moves in us. And sometimes God moves more powerfully than others. I believe God used the apostles and they wrote down things. I believe that the Spirit was present in every single time these stories were told to children, and they were told to remember them, because that was the Spirit. I mean, we have 40 plus years of oral tradition where we have no writing fragment, So no, it wasn't some dude sitting down writing it. It was the Spirit of God working in a broken humanity to maintain message. And 2,000 years later, it is. The proclamation is not perfect, but the message is.
But as you read through these messages also, it's like a message to us what is happening in the world today. If you look at that, it's just repeating it, telling us where we're going, but we don't be careful.
It is. I mean, and that's what they say. History is doomed to repeat itself, because we often don't. And as we looked at yesterday, we're in the midst of the fall of Rome. But it's the fall, and it's a fall of the superpower. And if you take the 100,000-foot view of history and world and global history of civilization as a whole, empires rise and empires fall.
About every 200 years.
And we're on a tinkering. We're tinkering a little bit. We're tinkering. But you know what though? The reality is everyone sitting in this room, by the time the country falls, will probably be not here. So I'm just kidding. Dina, were you gonna say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just.
Well, I think a contrast would be with the Mormon church, where they believe that Joseph Smith had these spectacles and that Moroni told him every word to write down. And they believe that every word that was written down was from this Moroni guy. And we don't, there's no claim in our scriptures that sort of thing happened.
But honestly, it requires just as much faith for, like you want to talk about something that parallels the onset of Christianity. So put us as Christians in 2,000 years of we're the dominant religion. Well, then you have, and I don't remember my LDS history is, I haven't taught it for many years, but I know it's in the, do you know how long ago LDS, does anyone know how long ago LDS started? When did Joseph Smith come on the scene?
Around mid 1800s.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
30-something.
So the same thing, they have a branch, they break off, there's a new prophet, there's a new writing, there's a new holy book, and they come into a time where holy books are valued. So now that book means so much more. LDS is growing. So now imagine, just to put that in the other context, so now imagine coming to a place where we get, let's just say you get a different world, we get an LDS president and they just deem everyone in the US LDS. Well, that's what happened when Constantine legalized Christianity for the Roman Empire. No one had a choice. If you were part of the empire, you were going to be Christian. Not the greatest way to draw in converts into. And you have to then take into account what that actually did. So every one of these massive cataclysmic events, like the destruction of Jerusalem, and I can't really underplay that enough. You have to read Matthew with the understanding of the desperate nature for identity. Who am I? Is God punishing Jerusalem, the Israelites again? Is this a sign that something is moving forward? Is it not? Well, it births new hope, as it should. But you got to, these folks who were there, and the truth is, I think the new Christians were probably empowered to do so because they had the Spirit in them. But even from the Jewish perspective, how would you feel? Here we go again. Has God left us again? And it's just a big cycle. Not only that, but Rome was coming in. They were already there. But now when they came in, what followed 70 of the destruction of Jerusalem was a far stronger military power. So Jews were now once again in a very disadvantaged place, as were Christians. And maybe not surprisingly that Romans had their part in all of the story as well.
Wouldn't that force the Jewish Christians to give up a lot of those Jewish traditions?
No, because they don't see it as a break. So if you think that you're the Jews and you're going on this way, and Christ comes, and now you're the true covenant being fulfilled. This isn't bad. This is all where you came from. Sorry, this way. This is just an extension. The people who aren't accepting it are the ones who are stopped. So it wasn't as if, we're abandoning our old faith. This is all one thing. And they're the ones who aren't accepting it. So that's why it's very critical in all the Gospels, the idea that Jesus did not come to abolish. It wasn't like you did it wrong before. It was to fulfill. It was actually taking the system that humanity had used. And one of these days, I want to dig into why humanity, or why people think humanity started sacrificing. Like that's just
that stopped.
Well, Cain enabled it. Well, it stopped with Christ.
So it stopped with the destruction of the temple.
Well, yes, that doesn't mean that it probably didn't happen in synagogues around the place. That doesn't mean there weren't still. You mean it not for Jewish Christians, but for Jews, I'm saying.
I don't think
Did they do it?
I don't think they
The Jews
do.
never did it
No, I
again?
don't think they do it except in the temple. I don't think they do it in the synagogue.
And again, I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Judaism scholar.
Well, I don't think so.
So something to look into.
But I think that was stopped when the temple was destroyed. And we don't do it because Christ fulfilled
Yeah.
that obligation, and we don't need to sacrifice anymore. And I would think the Jewish Christians at that time would have to come over to the idea of Christ being the one that fulfilled that.
Yes, but you got to remember, this was like a whole, think in terms of take yourself out of the Western US for a moment and think about yourself in that context, and that you were a Jewish Christian, and that the atonement sacrifice was needed, and all these purification rituals were needed, and it all was mediated through the temple and the priests. Now, some guy who makes a lot of claims, who has some powers, obviously, healing people, disrupting, comes on the scene, claims to be the Son of God. Religious authorities that I'm supposed to trust say that he's blasphemous. Do we end up killing him? Big things happen. But there's a lot of just confusion. And so did sacrifices still occur in Judaism after? I can't say for certain, but I don't know why you would change it if you didn't believe that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice.
I don't know any Jewish Christians that have sacrifices.
Well, not today,
I mean, not
perhaps.
Jewish people that have sacrifices.
Yeah, well, we should look into that. It'd be interesting to find that out.
But when Jesus overturned the money changers in the temple, wasn't he sending a strong message that whole practice of having to buy your sacrifice there that there was something wrong with that whole practice?
That can be an interpretation of that. Another interpretation of that was that because there were so many people coming to Jerusalem at the time that the reason they were selling those things, and his anger was that they took the holy space that was meant to be for pilgrims coming in, and they turned it into a way to make money off the pilgrims because there were the money changers were taking the foreign currencies and changing them into the currency they were using in Jerusalem so that they could then buy pigeons, probably a lot more pigeons than anything, to sacrifice. So right up to that point, there was still that. So I don't know.
I'm
I
sure
don't know.
they sacrificed until 70 AD.
Probably, and maybe after that they didn't. I mean, I think before the temple there were still sacrifices going on. So I don't know.
His parents did, didn't they?
What's that?
Didn't they come to the temple with a sacrifice, Mary and Joseph?
Yeah, I'm sure they would have.
And he would have been come along when he was 12 years old.
Yeah, I think what Don is saying is that 70 years after the destruction of the temple, when they lost the place to do the sacrifices, did sacrifice continue? Also, I will say that they didn't cast lots. They didn't roll dice after this time either, because of the spirit. Because dice, I know you think it's funny as gaming, but dice, God used dice to accomplish his will.
The open and the Furman or whatever it was called.
It says that they used the disciples cast lots to determine who the 12th disciple was to replace
So
Judas.
they
So
did in the Old
either that was like either Matthias got a bad roll of the dice, or God was using, and it was an acceptable form of divination even in.
But the priests had them too, that it was a name.
Yes,
Something else that they had. Yes,
Yeah,
the Old
because,
Testament.
well, and honestly, I think all of it adds up to that God uses our broken ways to redeem us. In other words,
Nebuchadnezzar, he used him to bring the Jews back to their senses.
God uses all sorts of things that we would deem unexpected. So maybe, that goes back to that. Did God really tell Abraham to go sacrifice his child? Maybe he did. Maybe he was testing if Abraham was going to follow a pagan ritual, which was to sacrifice your child. Or maybe Abraham just thought it up himself and thought that God was telling him to do that. The bottom line is God didn't want that to happen because God used something of a broken system. And that's what I'm saying. I don't know where the whole system of sacrifice even comes. It just appears in Cain and Abel. And then it goes from there. So, and then blood sacrifice becomes the norm. And so, okay. So it's 18 past. I don't want to hold you too long over. So themes. I want to go over themes, and I want to go over some of the unique or more important things about Matthew that you should just take with you. One, it's got a very strong countercultural theme, and you'll see that in 14 through 20 when that sort of upside down kingdom that we were talking about. You see that in the Sermon attitude. Like everyone to get the first should be last should be first. So the whole book, and you got to remember what they're speaking to is that Jewish audience that thinks we're going to be a military leader, we're going to be the nation that rules over all things. And, no, you're not. Actually, it's going to be different than what you think. And so he's busting their bubble, so to speak. Jesus is also portrayed as the new Moses in terms of the narrative flow. And that he is there to deliver the people from the tyranny. And there are a couple parallels. I'm not going to go into them just because of time, but there are parallels that are between Moses and Jesus throughout Matthew. And the reason is because they're Jews and they valued very highly Moses as a figure, and Moses and the prophets. That was pretty much it. And then King David. Major concern for Jewish identity. And again, I've harped on that enough just coming out of that period. Who are we? Who are we? And we're saying that, we're saying that now in this country. Who are we as a country? We're saying that now in Lake City as we wrestle over OHVs. Who are we as a city? What do we want to be? The wrestling with an identity, in particular, a corporate or a communal identity, is something that is not new. It's gone on for millennia. The interesting thing about the Matthew is it really has a strong emphasis again in that upside down kingdom. But Jesus was hanging out with prostitutes, tax collectors, and what we would consider the sort of base bottom line of humanity. And the religious leaders that we would think that maybe Jesus would rub elbows with, where he was criticizing. So it came at a time where Jewish authorities were abusing the system, as they had for many hundreds of years in different ways. And Jesus is calling him out on that. But Jesus sides, and honestly, that is probably one of the strongest things I think in the Western world. Again, we'll talk about the shimmers of this in the book group we're doing, but that we have neglected the idea that we are called to the margins. To the margins. In other words, tax collectors and prostitutes, and they're people who are not in mainstream society. They're those who are poor. There's more poverty in the southern half of our southern hemisphere. But if we look at who Jesus ministered to, he condemned the religious authorities. He condemned those in power. He condemned the institutions to some extent. And he sided with those who were the lowest, because they needed a sense of hope. Perhaps they weren't the ones maybe that ended up following him, but that was definitely a strong theme. So anyone who sort of looks at Matthew, there's a strong sense of loving a neighbor and the upside down nature of it that Israel is being used to bring about all of this. Strong emphasis on the fulfillment of the Torah and the prophecies that we both find in the prophets and in Moses in the Old Testament, and the fact that he came from the line of King David. This is re-emphasized again and again. The Son of Man is used often by Jesus because he didn't want to be viewed, we assume, as just this divine being. He wanted to be seen so that he was more readily understood his role. He was the man that the Jews thought would come. They thought they would have a physical man for a king. And Jesus, by saying, I'm the Son of Man, identifies himself with humanity and allows that sense of connection. Now, it didn't pay off necessarily in the end. It was also at a time where there was a massive dividing of Israel. You got to remember that up to this point, although there was a northern and a southern kingdom, they were still Jews. This is the first time that you have a major sect of Judaism break off. So this, they're only 40 years into it at the time of the destruction of the temple. So that's a major thing. Like all of a sudden, if we had a good chunk of us break off and go LDS or something else, and maybe that's kind of what happened. I mean, like that. And we look at it on a global perspective, it's not that big a deal, but on a smaller scale, in terms of a regional, they would have felt that in a far more powerful way. And lastly, and I think that it's more subtle, the divine nature of Jesus is emphasized in large part because Jesus came and you have his sort of human is emphasized, but the divine power connected to God, connected to Yahweh, exemplification, begotten Son, was very important for Matthew because he was speaking to Jews and they had seen many manifestations throughout the Old Testament of God. And this was meant to be understood as the fullest exemplification of who God was. Yeah.
That took about 300 years to really sink in.
What do you mean?
Well, there were, in some of the readings that I've read of other books, there was huge arguments about Islam.
Oh, absolutely.
And it wasn't until the
Council of Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea that it was solidified. Some places in Africa, some places in all over were all.
And it carried on too. And actually it was the Council of Chalcedon, I think 451, that they actually determined finally the divine and human nature balance. And what they said was that rather than saying 50-50, they said 100%, but with a primacy for the divine. So like that was the essential nature, but they don't want to deny the human nature because then it affects our understanding of the atonement. Like then it's a God dying for humanity rather than a human dying for humanity. And yeah, they wrestled with those. And quite frankly, they have good reason to. There are lots of things that he appeared in the form of a man. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's kind of confusing. Was he actually, they could touch him after the resurrection, before, like, was he real? So was he the Son of God? Was he adopted at the baptism?
Yeah.
Was he in adoptionism? Was a huge, what ended up being a heresy, but I can see why they would think that, because it seems as if all of a sudden this, but then you're denying the virgin birth, which is why Matthew actually highlights this sense of the virgin birth, because it's this. And not only that, but it refers back to a couple times throughout Matthew, the notion of Emmanuel, God is with us. So again, that we've been talking about in the Old Testament, that sense of presence. Where is God? And not only is that sort of the idea of Christ being Emmanuel, God is with us, that comes forth such a strong theme in Advent and around Christmas, God is with us. But interestingly enough, the end of Matthew, when Jesus offers the Great Commission, going to the ends of the world, baptizing and making disciples, baptizing and teaching all I've commanded you, and I will be with you to the end of the days, end of your days. So there's a sense of that Emmanuel presence that comes through. So from beginning to end, you have this sense of presence. And now the reason I say that is because one of the main themes that we've talked about over the Old Testament over the last year has been how the Israelites understood God's presence with them in any given point. So this was God's presence dwelling with them all the time. Okay, we got 3 minutes. We can go a few minutes over. I'll just really, this is just more format. I just want to highlight a few things, and then I'll go to the structure really quickly. One, it's the only one that really contains, Matthew's the only book or gospel that contains a genealogy. And it's important that it starts that way because for Jews, it traces Jesus back to Abraham. And also for us as Gentiles, it includes Rahab, a Gentile, and Ruth, a Gentile. These connections to Gentile women who have contributed to this line of David, saying it's not a pure line. God included Gentiles along the way. It contains the Beatitudes in their fullest forms, and Luke contains 4 of them that in a similar form on the Sermon on the Mount. Luke and Matthew both contain the Sermon on the Mount, but Matthew has a fuller exposition of it, a fuller sort of teaching of it, and typically where we'll go to for it. And it contains probably the most notable or most used version of the Great Commission. The Great Commission. Before Jesus' ascension, he commissions the disciples to go out. And so those 3 things really sort of stand as being defining characteristics of Matthew, even if you don't look at it from the Jewish perspective. They just sort of contain, the genealogy. And really the story of, really, we read Matthew, we read Luke and John, but we read Matthew a lot when it comes to Epiphany because it's the only one that mentions the Magi. And that's an important, I'll say, just because that is in the beginning, as we can use that as we go through this real quickly. The Magi are important for the story or for the narrative for Jews because it is not just this miraculous thing happened, Jesus being born, but Gentiles that are from without the system that was happening in the Middle East, and they thought they're from Persia, the remnants of that, India, and Asia. Like Asian, Oriental Asian. And honestly, there could have been more kings, could have been less kings. There's a lot of controversy around that. But the idea that these Magi came and worshiped Jesus is the Gentile acknowledgement that Jesus was a king, not just for the Jews, but for the world. And so it expands that vision of Jewish readers to say, this isn't just for us, a redemption of us. And it draws back to the narrative of Moses, where when those first laws were given, and as the Levitical laws developed, Yahweh called Israel to be light unto the nations. Okay. I'm trying to think what is the most important thing. So 1 to 3, I'm just going to go through. I'll just sort of shout it out, and you can look at these in your past. But if I see some interesting things, I'll mention. 1 to 3 is really the beginning of Jesus. You have the genealogy went from Abraham. There's a mention of bringing it to David, so he fills that kingly role. Jesus is claimed as the Emmanuel. 4 through 7, Jesus is on the scene. Starts with a baptism. desert temptations. Jesus goes into ministry. He's announcing God's kingdom. He's performing some miracles, and then he ends up, so once he's done some miracles and he has met the needs of the people, he turns to and does a teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, and it becomes this first sort of teaching moment. Then you go into the second section, which would be 8 through 13, or 11, I guess 11, 12, just depending. People divide them a little differently here and there. But you have in that sort of these 9 stories of Jesus ushering in the kingdom. And they're in 3 groups. And in between these groups, he heals people. So this is kind of just characterizing, but again, that's a Hebrew parallel sort of pattern. Jesus heals 3 stories of Jesus' healing. Three stories of Jesus' healing, and then he says, "Follow me." There's a section on discipleship. 3 stories of Jesus' healing. He says, "Follow me." And so there's a sense of he's building a repertoire amongst the people, but he's not just healing. He's saying, "Follow me. I have good news." In chapter 10, Jesus comes to the point where he sends out his disciples and feels that they're okay, and it's sort of their first sending. So Jesus is ushering in the kingdom, not only with the healing and calling people to follow him is there, but the sending out the disciples, expanding that kingdom in that way, that kingdom of heaven on earth. If you look at 11 through 13, you have sort of the initial responses to Jesus' early ministry. People are claiming him as the Messiah. The Pharisees start their he's a blasphemer sort of information. Even John the Baptist is not really 100% sure who he is, and there's those in the neutral crowd, although he identifies him. But is he John the Baptist? Is John? There's some confusion there. But this is also where you start to get the beginning of the parables of the kingdom of heaven. That moves us to 14 through 20, which largely deals with Jesus's identity. In this upside down kingdom notion. So there are parables in this throughout that deal with this is the mustard seed. These are the divine reversal, if you will. That brings us up to 20, and you could say some of the other gospels would call the beginning of the passion, but because because Matthew inserts some other things in there. 21 begins with his entry into Jerusalem and the tearing down of the temple, some would assert that his tearing down of the temple would have been the cause of some of his demise, like he flipped all the tables, he made everyone mad. Or who's this troublemaker? He's a blasphemer. He's taken it too far now. If we don't stop him, he's going to cause a revolt. It's going to be a huge thing. This sets the Romans on edge. In 23 through 25, you have a strong critique. It's Jesus' last critique in Matthew of the Pharisees. It's kind of like he sort of says, "I'm going to tear this down, and I'm going to, call you what you are." And then he gives his final teaching to the disciples, and he tries to reveal the whole salvation narrative. And this is again spelled out because the Jews are meant to sort of get this in the narrative format. So that they understand it in relationship to what's about to happen, or what did happen, but for those years at the moment would have been what's about to happen. And then 26 through 28 is the Passover meal in the Eucharist, which is the sort of the Eucharist or the communion is the re-envisioning of the Passover. What is being sort of underscored in the Passover, the need to atone for one's sins, is now Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb. And then he's arrested, tried, tortured, and killed. And then it holds the ascension as being sort of the final moment of Jesus. And then we get this great passage of this commit. We talked about this just a few minutes ago, that Great Commission, where everyone that followed was to sort of this is if you want to talk about Christian vocation, this is our vocation. To proclaim, to baptize, disciple. So much of what we call missional theology comes from this passage of the Great Commission, but Matthew in general has been used for that sort of, like if anyone talks about the Great Commission or Jesus' ascension, you get this passage where and it's like Jesus' final words on earth. These are the last things that he said to those followers who were there. He had chosen anything to say, and he commissioned them and he sent them the same way he did earlier in that. He sent them out. And so for Jews, this is like, hey, not only am I differentiating myself, I have a continued role, and that is to proclaim the message of this man, this God that I'm following. And in doing that and proclaiming that, I fulfill my sense of vocation for what the Spirit has been given me for. So,
That is of all nations,
all nations,
all nations,
all nations,
not just Jews.
not just the Jews. All right. That's it. That's all I got.
Good job.
It was fun though. I enjoyed looking through Matthew. Again, I said to Shannon,